The jungle of Rykul was never silent. The air always carried the cry of hunting beasts and the rustle of wings in the high trees. But tonight the darkness felt heavy and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Far to the north, a predator known as Scar moved with slow and powerful steps. His eyes glowed faint gold in the dim light from the moons above. He was the alpha of the hunting ranges, and every creature knew his scent and his roar. Yet even he felt a cold unease under his skin. Hours ago his cubs had been curled in the den, warm and safe beside their mother, the scent of her fur wrapping around them like a shield. But when Scar returned from the night hunt, the den was empty. The air was thick with the scent of fear. His mate lay still with a wound across her side, breathing but weak, and the small shapes of his cubs were gone. He pressed his nose to the ground and caught a faint trail, thin and strange, and in it was something that made his muscles tighten. There was no scent of struggle, no trail of blood, only the fading smell of the little ones mixed with something alien. He moved through the tall grass with his head low, the moonlight painting the edges of his fur in silver. Each step was silent but filled with power. His senses stretched out into the night, listening for the smallest sound. The trail led to the riverbank, where the water moved slow and black under the starlight. Here the track stopped. The mud showed only the soft marks of small paws. Then nothing. The current carried no scent, and the wind whispered of nothing living nearby. The jungle around him was too quiet. Even the insects seemed to have fled. Scar's mind raced with images of what could have taken them: rival predators, shadow beasts from the deep forest, the winged hunters that came with the storms. Yet none of these fit the strange trail. The smell that clung to the grass was not of his world. It was warm, metallic, and faintly sweet, a smell that stirred an old memory, one he had not thought of since he was a young hunter, a memory of watching strange shapes walk on two legs, shapes that carried fire in their hands and spoke in sharp voices. The alpha turned his head toward the north, his golden eyes narrowing. The trail was gone from the ground, but the strange scent was stronger in the air. His heart pounded with a slow and deep rhythm. He moved toward it, his tail low, every muscle ready to strike. Shadows shifted as he passed under thick branches. Eyes from other creatures watched him, but none dared step into his path. They could feel the fury and the way his claws dug into the earth. Far away, high in the canopy, a thin creature clung to a branch, its eyes wide as it saw the alpha pass. It had seen the one who took the cubs, a tall figure with no fur on its face, wrapped in strange cloth, walking upright and carrying both cubs in its arms. The figure had moved fast, faster than any creature of the forest should, and it had gone toward the old lands where the metal ruins lay silent under the vines. The thin creature made no sound. It knew to speak was to invite death from the alpha or from the thing that had taken the young. The air grew colder as Scar moved deeper into the northern forest. The trees twisted here, their roots like claws digging into the black soil. The smell of the river faded, but the strange scent only grew stronger. He passed over old ground where bones lay white under the leaves. He remembered the battles fought here, the intruders that came from the sky in great falling lights, and the way the land had burned for days after. He thought those days were gone, but the scent in his nose told him he was wrong. Scar stopped and raised his head. The wind shifted and carried a faint sound to him. It was not the cry of a beast or the hiss of an insect. It was soft, almost gentle, a sound like the hum a mother makes to calm her young. His ears twitched, his breath slowed. He took another step, and the sound faded. Then came again, this time with a small higher note, a sound he knew better than any other, the tiny chirp of his cubs when they were safe and warm. The sound cut into his chest like a blade of ice and fire. He broke into a silent run, weaving through the trees with deadly grace. The jungle blurred past him, his paws silent against the earth. The scent was clear now. It wrapped around him, leading him forward, pulling him like a chain. Each breath was filled with it, and mixed within was the steady beat of a heart that was not predator and not prey. A heartbeat strange yet strong, a rhythm that felt out of place in this world. Somewhere ahead in the shadows, something moved, not fast, not fleeing, but steady and sure. Scar slowed, his eyes narrowing to slits. He could see shapes between the trees, the pale hint of something not born of Rykul. The sound of the cubs came again, soft and unafraid, and the strange heartbeat stayed close to them. Scar's claws slid from their sheaths. The fur on his neck rose high. He stepped forward into the last line of shadows before the clearing. The night air was thick, the moon was high, and the alpha predator was about to see the thing that dared take his young, the thing that had walked into his world without fear, and had left the den without leaving a single drop of blood behind. The strange scent hung in the air like a shadow that could not be seen, but could be felt deep in the chest. Scar stood still at the edge of the clearing, his ears turning slowly to catch every sound in the dark. The cubs were close, yet the scent told him that something alien kept them from him. Humans were not supposed to be here, not in this part of the world, not in any part of the predator's range. The last human had been seen 10 seasons ago, and it had not left alive. Yet here was a trail that carried both the scent of his young and the mark of a creature that walked on 2 legs. The alpha lowered himself until his chest brushed the ground and moved forward inch by inch. His eyes glinted like molten gold as moonlight broke through the leaves above. The earth was damp under his paws, and each step pressed his claws into the soil, leaving deep marks that warned any who followed. The jungle around him shifted, and the trees leaned close, as if listening to his silent passage. The wind whispered from the north, and brought the scent of water mixed with metal. It was a scent older than the cubs themselves, a scent from the old crash site, where the sky fire had once fallen and burned the earth to glass. Scar's mind flickered with memory. The night of the falling light, the strange metal shapes that had split open to release thin pale creatures wrapped in cloth and steel, creatures that had fire in their hands and strange light in their eyes. They had hunted not for food, but for something unseen. They had taken from the jungle and given nothing back. And in the end the jungle had taken them all. Or so Scar had believed until now. The trail curved through the undergrowth in a way no predator would choose. It avoided the open paths and crossed thorn thickets and fallen logs. The 2-legged one moved, as if it feared something larger in the forest. Perhaps it feared Scar himself. Or perhaps it feared the other predators, who also ruled these lands. The alpha paused as a shape moved in the shadows to his left. A pack of long-fanged prowlers had gathered their yellow eyes watching him. They could smell the trail too, and they wanted the cubs not to return them, but to silence them forever. A rival pack always sought to end the bloodline of the alpha. A deep growl rolled from Scar's chest, low and thunderous. It spread through the clearing like a storm warning. The prowlers shifted uneasily, their ears flattening back. The largest of them stepped forward, lips peeled back from teeth that dripped with hunger. Yet it stopped just short of challenging. One by one the prowlers slipped back into the shadows, leaving only their fading scent behind. The jungle knew this was Scar's hunt, and no creature dared share it with him. The path grew narrower and darker. Twisted roots rose from the ground like the ribs of some dead giant. Above, the canopy shut out most of the moonlight, leaving the forest floor in dim shadow. The scent of the human was clearer now, stronger with every breath. Scar could almost taste it on his tongue. It was warm and strange, and mixed with the faint sweetness of the cub's scent. There was something else too, something faint that did not belong to fur or flesh, a scent of fire and oil that only came from the tools of the sky walkers. A soft sound drifted through the air, the quiet snap of a branch under weight. Scar froze, his ears turning sharply toward it. He crept forward and saw a faint glimmer ahead. Not the glow of eyes, but a steady pale light that flickered against the trunks of the trees. It was not fire. It was colder than fire. The same kind of light the sky walkers carried when they moved in darkness. His paws pressed into the earth as he slid closer, his breath slow and silent. The light moved ahead, and with it came a faint rhythm like the beat of a heart, though not as strong or as deep as his own. He reached a ridge of rock and crouched at the top. Below was a gully filled with mist and tangled vines. In the center of it a figure moved upright on 2 legs. The shape was thin and long, with strange coverings over its body and a pack on its back. It paused and looked around as if sensing danger, but did not look up toward where Scar crouched. In its arms it held 2 small shapes pressed close against its chest. The cubs' small tails hung limp, and their heads rested under the figure's chin. They were not bound or hurt. They were sleeping in the arms of the very thing Scar had sworn to destroy if it ever returned to his lands. The sight twisted something inside him. His mind told him to leap, to take back what was his. Yet his senses told him the cubs were calm. Their scent carried no fear, only warmth and the faint trace of the strange food that clung to the human scent. This made no sense. Prey should fear the predator, and predators should guard their young from anything unknown. Yet here the cubs lay against the human's chest as if they had always known him. The figure began to move again, climbing the far side of the gully toward the north, toward the old crash site. The air in that direction carried the smell of rust and dust and the deep stillness of a place long abandoned by life. Scar followed from above, keeping to the shadows, his steps silent as muscles coiled for the moment to strike. The human's pace was steady but not rushed. It moved as if it had nowhere to hide and no need to run. This confidence made Scar's claws itch for blood, yet something in the way the human cradled the cubs held him back. The jungle changed as they moved. The trees thinned and gave way to open ground scattered with black stones and twisted metal shapes, half buried in the earth. These were the bones of the Sky Walker's machines, silent and cold. Some lay cracked open, showing strange ribs of steel. Others still hummed faintly with the whisper of forgotten power. The human passed among them without fear, its feet finding paths between the wrecks, as if it had walked this way many times before. Scar's eyes scanned the ruins. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every hollow could be a trap. His nostrils flared at the mingling scents of metal and dust. Yet the human walked straight to a low shelter made from the broken hull of a great ship. Vines hung from its sides, and the roof was patched with leaves and hides. The entrance was dark, but the human stepped inside, without pause, carrying the cubs close. Scar moved closer, his body low to the ground, his heart pounding with a deep, steady beat. He could hear the cubs breathing softly, the sound carrying in the night air. From the darkness of the shelter came a sound that made Scar halt. A voice low and rough, yet shaped into words of his own tongue. It spoke his name. The sound was not perfect, but it was clear enough that the fur along his back lifted high. No human should know the name of the Alpha. No human should be able to form the sounds of his people's speech. Yet this one had done so without fear. Scar remained in the shadows, his golden eyes fixed on the dark opening of the shelter. The jungle around him was silent, the air was still, and for the first time since the disappearance of his cubs, Scar felt something he could not name. It was not anger and not fear. It was the pull of a question too deep for the night to answer, the kind of question that would not let go until it was faced. The moons hung low in the sky, their pale light spilling through the jagged gaps in the canopy and touching the broken metal bones of the old crash site. The air here was heavy with the scent of rust and old fire. Scar moved without sound, his paws gliding over the earth as if he were part of the shadows themselves. His eyes never left the shelter where the human had gone, carrying his cubs against its chest as if they were its own. He lowered himself onto the cold ground, his chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. Each inhale brought him the smell of his young mixed with the warmth of the human, and something else, a faint trace of strange plants and water that had no taste of this land. His ears turned forward, listening to the smallest shift of leaves. From inside the shelter came the sound of soft breathing, the steady rhythm of the cubs sleeping, and a slower, deeper beat. That was the heart of the human. Scar crept closer until he was at the edge of the shelter's shadow. The entrance was low, but wide enough for him to leap through in a single bound. Yet he did not move. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and shapes began to take form. He saw the human lying on its back on a bed of woven leaves, its head resting against a piece of cloth folded many times. The cubs were curled on its chest, their tiny sides rising and falling with each breath. One cub had a paw draped across the human's neck, and the other pressed its nose against the human's jaw. They were not afraid. They were not tense. They were at peace. For a moment Scar could not move. The sight before him did not belong to the laws of predator and prey. It was something from an older world, a world where bonds could form without blood and oaths could be made without words. His mind searched for reason, yet found none. He had expected the cubs to be bound or hurt or caged, but instead they were being guarded as if by one of their own. The human's eyes opened slowly in the dim light. They were not the pale eyes of prey looking upon death. They were dark and steady, and they locked on Scar's without flinching. The human spoke in a voice low and rough, but clear enough for the Alpha to understand. It spoke his name, not as a question, but as if it already knew who he was. The sound struck him like the crack of thunder over the high cliffs. No human should know his name, Yet this one carried it in its voice, as if it had been carved. There long ago. Scar's claws flexed against the ground. His muscles coiled, but he did not leap. He needed to know how this human knew him, and why it held his cubs in safety instead of harm. The human raised a hand slowly, not in threat, but in calm. It rested the hand on the back of one cub, and stroked its fur gently. The cub made a soft sound and pressed closer into the warmth of the human's body. 1,000 instincts screamed inside Scar to take his young and leave this place. Yet another voice, older and quieter, told him to wait and listen. The human scent carried no fear, but it carried something else, something he had not smelled since the day his mate gave birth to the cubs. It was the scent of care and protection, and a promise unspoken. The human sat up slowly, careful not to wake the cubs. It spoke again in halting words, mixing its own tongue with pieces of Scar's. The meaning came through in broken shapes. It had found the cubs far from the den 2 nights past. They had been hungry and cold, their tiny bodies shaking with exhaustion. The human had fed them from its own rations, had carried them through the rain and the cold, had wrapped them in cloth to keep them warm. It had not taken them as prey, but had taken them as something it must protect. Scar listened to words forming pictures in his mind. The trail he had followed through thorn and shadow now made sense. The human had not chosen the difficult path to hide from him, but to avoid the other predators that would have taken the cubs for food or for vengeance. The memory of the rival pack on the trail came to him, and he knew they would not have hesitated to end his bloodline if they could. The shelter smelled faintly of herbs and clean water. In one corner was a small fire pit, cold now, but lined with stones. Near it lay strange tools made of metal and cloth. Some Scar remembered from the fallen Skywalkers. Others were unknown to him. On the walls of the shelter hung pieces of hide and scraps of woven fiber, forming a crude barrier against the wind. In one corner a small pouch lay open, showing dried strips of meat. Scar's nose told him it was from a beast not of this jungle. The human had traveled far and carried what it could to survive. The human spoke again, its voice softer this time. It did not move toward Scar, but it did not move away. It told him it would leave if he wished it so. It would give the cubs back without fight. But it asked only that he understand it had not meant harm. Scar could read truth in the way the human's heartbeat did not quicken in fear. The way its scent stayed steady and calm. It was the scent of one who had already chosen their path and would not turn from it. Outside the shelter the jungle shifted. A faint rustle in the vines told Scar that something watched from the dark. The scent reached him a heartbeat later, and his ears flattened in warning. The rival pack had found the trail again and had followed it to the crash site. Their numbers were many, and their hunger was sharp. They would not care if the cubs were with the alpha or with the human. They would kill and take, and leave nothing but bones. Scar stepped into the shelter, fully his shadow, filling the space. The cubs stirred but did not wake. The human looked up at him, waiting for his choice. The alpha lowered his head until his nose almost touched the sleeping forms of his young. He breathed in their warmth and their safety. Then he turned his gaze to the human and gave a low growl, not of warning, but of command. The human seemed to understand, for it reached for a small pack and slung it over its shoulder without waking the cubs. The sound outside grew closer, the soft pad of many paws moving as one. Eyes like pale moons flickered in the darkness between the ruins. The rival pack was closing in. Scar stepped to the entrance, his body a wall of muscle and fur. Behind him the human rose to its feet, still cradling the cubs. The night air was thick with the smell of blood that had not yet been spilled. The alpha's claw slid out, and the fur along his spine rose high. He knew the fight was coming, and it would be fierce. The rival pack stepped from the shadows one by one, until a dozen of them stood in the open. Their leader came last, a great beast with scars down its flank and teeth that glistened wet in the moonlight. It looked past Scar and saw the human holding the cubs. Its lips pulled back in a slow, cruel snarl. The scent it carried was not just hunger. It was the scent of fresh kill, and in that scent was the bitter truth. The blood on its teeth was that of Scar's mate. The rival pack stood in the open, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on the shelter. The night air was heavy with the scent of challenge, and the cold light of the moons turned their fur into silver shadows. Scar did not move from the entrance, his body blocking the path, his claws ready to tear the earth if needed. Behind him the human stood, still cradling the cubs close. Their soft breaths were the only sound inside the shelter. The leader of the rival pack stepped forward, its paws silent on the broken ground. Its eyes gleamed with the cruel joy of a hunter that has already tasted victory. The scent of Scar's mate's blood clung to its muzzle, a dark reminder of what it had done. The growl that rose from Scar's chest was low and deep like distant thunder. The rival leader answered with a growl of its own, a sound that promised death for anyone in its path. Yet before the clash came the human's voice, broke the heavy silence. It was quiet but firm and carried a weight that seemed out of place in the middle of a predator standoff. The sound drew Scar's ear, and for a heartbeat he turned his head toward it. The human spoke in broken pieces of Scar's tongue mixed with its own language. Its words were rough and halting, but they held no fear. Instead, they carried a strange calm. It told him that it knew this pack had been following for hours, that it had been ready for them, and that if Scar allowed it to stand beside him, the cubs would not be taken. Scar's eyes narrowed, but he did not silence the human. Instead, he let it speak. The human shifted slightly to adjust the cubs and began to tell its story in short pieces that were more pictures than words. It had not come to this world as part of a hunt or a raid. It had come as part of a ship sent to map the stars and find worlds for study. The crash had been sudden, violent. The sky had torn open with fire, and the ground had rushed up like a wall. When the smoke cleared, the human had been alone among the wreckage, its crewmates gone, its supplies few. The jungle had closed around it as if to swallow it whole. For days it had wandered through the heat and the shadows, living on what little it could take from the wreck. It had learned quickly that this was not a place that forgave mistakes. Every night it heard the roars of predators, and every morning it found new tracks around its shelter. It spoke of watching from a high tree as two massive beasts fought in the valley below, their bodies striking the ground with such force that the tree shook. It had known then that to survive it must move unseen and unheard. One night in a cold rain it had heard the faint cries of something small and weak. It had followed the sound to find two small shapes shivering under a fallen branch. The cubs had been thin, their eyes barely open, their bodies trembling from hunger and cold. The human had not thought then of what they were or to whom they belonged. It had only known that if it left them there, they would not see another sunrise. It had wrapped them in the dry cloth from its pack and fed them from the last of its rations. The cubs had pressed against its chest for warmth and slept without fear. In that moment the human had felt something it had not felt since the days before the crash. A reason to keep moving, a reason to fight for the next day. The human told Scar that it had moved every night, avoiding the open paths and keeping the cubs close. It had seen the rival pack's eyes in the dark many times. It had heard their growls on the wind. It had even used small fires and strange tools from the wreck to drive them away. But the pack had kept coming. The human knew it could not fight them alone for long. It had hoped to reach the old crash site where metal walls could offer some protection. Yet it had not known that the Alpha would follow its trail so closely. Scar listened, his ears flicking at every sound outside, but his eyes stayed on the human. The story was simple, yet the scent told him it was true. The human had no reason to lie. Its heartbeat was steady, its breathing calm. The cub shifted slightly in its arms, but did not wake. Scar could see now the marks on the human's skin, where thorns had torn it, and the faint limp in its step from a wound that had not yet healed. This was not the body of prey that had been hiding in fear. This was the body of one that had endured the hunt and kept moving. Outside, the rival pack began to spread out their paws, silent, their tails low. They were preparing to strike from more than one side. Scar's tail lashed once against the ground. He stepped fully out of the shelter, his head high, his golden eyes burning in the moonlight. The human followed him without hesitation, still holding the cubs. It moved to stand behind him, but within reach. There was no scent of fear from it, only a readiness, as if it had already decided to face whatever came. The rival leader growled again, the sound rolling over the ruins like a wave. Its pack answered with a chorus of snarls. Scar's answer was a single roar that shook the air. The sound carried across the ruins and into the forest beyond. It was the sound of an alpha claiming his ground and warning all who heard that to cross it was to invite death. The rival leader did not back away. Instead, it lowered its head and began to move forward, each step slow and deliberate. The others followed their eyes, locked on the cubs in the human's arms. The human reached into the pack on its back with one hand and pulled out a small device of metal and glass. It pressed a part of the device, and a sudden burst of light and sound erupted from it. The light was blinding even to Scar's eyes, and the sound was a piercing scream that made the rival pack flinch back. The scent of their fear was sharp for a brief moment. The human held the device high, keeping the noise between them and the pack. Scar saw the opening it created and stepped forward ready to strike if they moved again. But the rival leader was cunning. It circled away from the sound and began to approach from the side, its pack splitting into two lines. The human turned to follow its movement, but it could not cover both sides at once. Scar shifted his stance, his claws digging into the dirt. The battle was coming closer with every heartbeat. He knew that if they broke through to the cubs, there would be no mercy. His muscles tensed, and his breath slowed to the steady rhythm of a hunter about to strike. The human glanced at him, its eyes meeting his for a heartbeat. There was no need for words. In that look, Scar understood that this human would not drop the cubs even if it meant death. It would stand until the end. And in that same heartbeat, Scar made his choice. This fight would not be the humans' fight alone. It would be theirs together. The rival pack began to move faster, their growls rising like a storm. The human stepped back toward the shelter to protect the cubs from the first rush. Scar moved forward to meet the attack head on, his roar splitting the night as the first of the rival beasts leapt from the shadow's teeth, flashing in the moonlight, and claws reaching for his throat. The first leap came from the left, a blur of muscle and claws bursting from the shadows. The rival beast aimed for Scar's throat, its jaws wide and glistening in the cold light. Scar twisted with the speed of a striking storm, his paw slamming into its side, sending it crashing into the ground. Before it could rise, his teeth were at its neck, his roar echoing through the ruins. The other beasts did not falter. They surged forward, their bodies low, their eyes locked on the cubs, held in the human's arms. The human stepped back toward the shelter, one arm cradling the cubs, the other gripping the strange device of light and sound. It flared again in a searing flash, forcing two of the attackers to veer away, their growls turning to hisses of pain. Scar moved between the human and the nearest threat, his claws slicing through the air and catching another rival across the muzzle. The scent of blood rose sharp and hot. The wounded beast stumbled but did not retreat. The rival leader hung back, watching the fight with cold patience, its eyes shifting from Scar to the human, measuring them both. It had not survived this long by throwing itself into a fight too soon. It would wait for the moment when both were tired, when the gap opened wide enough to strike. Its pack obeyed, circling, snapping, striking from the edges, forcing Scar to turn and turn again. The ground was a blur of moving bodies and flashing teeth. The human ducked into the shelter for a heartbeat, placing the cubs in a corner wrapped in cloth and hides. Their small eyes opened, and they whimpered softly, but did not cry out. The human returned to the entrance empty, handed no longer carrying the device. Instead, it held a long shard of metal torn from the wreck, its edge jagged and sharp. It took a stance beside Scar, its knees bent, its grip tight. The predators hesitated for only a breath before surging again. Scar slammed into one beast, driving it back into a wall of twisted steel, the impact ringing through the night. The human swung the shard in a wide arc, catching another across the side of its head. The beast yelped and rolled away, shaking its skull, the smell of its fear brief but real. Yet for each rival driven back, another pressed forward. They were many, and they were hungry, and they wanted the cubs more than anything. The fight spilled into the open ground outside the shelter, the moons casting long shadows over the broken metal and vines. Scar moved like a storm, his roars shaking the air, his claws tearing at any that came close. The human kept pace, its swing short and precise, its feet never stopping. Together they held the narrow path to the shelter, turning every advance into a wall of pain. The rivals began to change their tactics, splitting into three groups, one to harry Scar, one to keep the human busy, and one to slip around toward the cubs. Scar saw the movement, and his roar cut the night. He lunged at the nearest rival with such force that the ground cracked beneath him. The beast screamed as his weight drove it into the dirt. The human turned and ran back to the shelter just as two shadows slipped inside. The sound of metal striking flesh rang out, and one of the attackers staggered back, blood streaming from its side. The other leapt at the human's back, but Scar was there, his jaws closing on its spine, the snap echoing like breaking branches. The rival leader saw its pack faltering and gave a sharp bark. The sound pulled the survivors together for a final rush. They came as one, a wall of teeth and fur. Scar braced himself, his chest heaving, his golden eyes bright with fire. The human stepped up beside him, blood streaked across its arm, but its grip on the shard was strong. There was no speech, no plan, only the shared instinct to protect what mattered. They met the rush with fury, Scar tearing through the front line with claws and teeth, the human striking low and fast at legs and bellies. The air filled with the sound of snarls, roars, and the wet rip of flesh. Bodies crashed into the ground, the dirt darkening with blood. Scar felt teeth sink into his shoulder, and he twisted, breaking free with a savage shake. The human cried out as claws raked its side, but did not fall, its arm swinging again and again until the beast dropped away. The rival leader pushed forward, now its patience gone, its eyes locked on the cubs. Scar saw it coming and charged the impact, throwing them both into a tumble of fur and steel. They rolled across the ground, biting, clawing, striking. The leader was strong, but Scar was stronger. His teeth found the soft place under its jaw, and he bit down until the rival struggle slowed and then stopped. The leader's body went limp, and Scar rose above it, blood running down his muzzle. The surviving rivals froze, their eyes shifting from the dead leader to the alpha who stood over it. They backed away slowly, their growls low and uncertain. One by one they turned and melted into the shadows, until the clearing was empty save for the dead and the dying. The jungle began to breathe again, the silence lifting to lead in the whisper of leaves and the distant calls of the night. Scar turned toward the shelter, his body aching, his breath heavy. The human was already inside, crouched over the cubs, checking them with quick, careful hands. The cubs pressed against its chest, their small eyes blinking up at him. Scar stepped inside. The space was tight, but it felt safe now. The human looked up, meeting his gaze, and there was no fear, there only exhaustion and relief. Scar lowered his head until his nose touched the cubs, and they gave small chirps in answer. The ground outside was marked with the signs of the battle, paw prints deep in the dirt, streaks of blood, the bodies of the fallen. The air smelled of iron and smoke, but also of victory. The rival pack would not return, not soon, not while the memory of their leader's death was fresh. Scar knew this, but he also knew they would remember that the human had stood and fought beside him, that the cubs had been guarded not only by the alpha, but by something alien and unexpected. The human leaned back against the wall of the shelter, its eyes closing for a moment. Scar watched it, his mind turning over the night's events. By the laws of his kind, the human should be nothing to him, yet it had bled for his young, had risked its life, without thought. That was a debt not easily cast aside. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the highest leaves of the jungle, turning them to gold. Scar knew this fight was over, but something larger had begun. The cubs curled together between them, their small bodies warm against the cold air. The human's hand rested lightly on their backs, even in sleep. Scar lay beside them, his great body forming a wall between them and the open night. The scent of the human was now mixed with the scent of his own bloodline, a sign that in the eyes of the jungle they had fought as one. And as the sun began to rise over the broken metal bones of the crash site, Scar understood that this human was no longer just a stranger in his land. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the jungle when the sound came again, a deep rolling growl from far beyond the crash site. It was not the voice of the rival pack that had fled into the shadows. This was heavier, older, and filled with a hunger that did not fade with fear. Scar rose from where he had been resting, his eyes narrowing toward the sound. The human stirred as well, its hand tightening protectively over the cubs, who blinked and pressed closer, sensing the tension in the air. The jungle around the crash site began to shift, leaves trembled and the canopy vines swayed. Without wind, small creatures darted for cover, their sudden flight carrying the silent warning that something far more dangerous was moving through the forest. Scar's nose caught the scent, a mix of earth and stone and blood, a predator of the deep forest, one that rarely came to the open grounds unless driven by great hunger or challenge. It was a lone beast, but in size and strength it could match 3 alphas together, and its hunger was said to be endless. The human rose to its feet, wincing from wounds taken in the siege, its eyes searching Scar's face for meaning in the sound and the scent. Scar gave a short, low growl in answer, not of anger, but of warning. This was no ordinary hunt. This was a fight that would not end until one side was silent forever. The human understood and moved quickly, gathering what little gear remained from the shelter, its hand pausing on the jagged shard of metal, now dark with dried blood. It slung the pack across its shoulder and turned toward the cubs, lifting them into the crook of its arm with a gentleness that seemed impossible in the shadow of what was coming. The growl came again closer, now the sound shaking loose bits of dust from the broken metal walls. The ground under their feet gave a faint tremor. With each step the approaching beast took, Scar stepped out into the open, his body framed in the pale gold of early light, his fur bristling along his spine, his eyes fixed on the tree where the sound grew louder. The human stood beside him, not behind him, the cubs pressed close against its chest, their small eyes wide and watchful. The beast emerged from the trees like a shadow, given form, its body massive, its head low, its eyes a deep red that caught the light like embers. Its claws dug deep furrows in the soil with each step, and its breath came in long, slow gusts that fogged in the morning air. Scars ran across its shoulders and flanks, telling the story of battles won and survived. It was a hunter that had lived long enough to learn patience and cruelty both. It fixed its gaze first on Scar, then on the human and the cubs, and its lips curled back to show teeth longer than a man's hand. Scar answered with a roar that split the quiet of dawn, a sound that told the jungle this was his ground, and he would not yield it. The human said nothing, but shifted its stance, the shard of metal in one hand, the other, keeping the cubs close. The beast began to move forward slowly, each step deliberate, as if testing the will of those who stood before it. Scar stepped to meet it, his muscles tight, his tail low, the fur along his neck rising higher. They clashed in the center of the open ground, the impact loud as stone breaking. Scar's claws raked across the beast's shoulder, drawing deep lines of blood. The beast swung its massive head, catching Scar in the ribs and sending him sliding back. The human shouted a sharp sound and darted forward, slashing the shard of metal across the beast's flank. The cut was shallow, but it drew the beast's attention away from Scar for a heartbeat. The cubs whimpered in the human's arm, but did not cry out. Scar lunged again, biting deep into the beast's neck, the taste of hot blood filling his mouth. The beast roared and twisted, throwing him off. It turned toward the human, its great paw swinging out in a blow that could crush bone. The human twisted aside, the edge of claw catching its side and tearing the fabric in flesh. Pain flashed across its face, but it did not fall. Instead, it drove the shard into the beast's leg, the point biting deep. Scar used the moment to leap onto the beast's back, his claws sinking in as he tore at its spine. The beast bucked and rolled, trying to throw him off. The human stepped back to keep the cubs safe, its eyes locked on the fight, ready to strike again if the chance came. The ground shook with their struggle, dust rising into the air, mixing with the scent of blood and rage. The sounds of roars and snarls filled the clearing, echoing through the jungle like a warning to all who could hear. The beast rolled again, and Scar was thrown to the side, landing hard against a piece of broken hull. He rose, shaking his head, his breath coming fast. The beast turned toward the human once more, this time its intent clear and deadly. The human stood firm, though blood ran down its arm, and sighed, its stance wide, its grip on the shard tight. At the last moment before the beast could strike, Scar slammed into its side with all the force in his body, driving it away from the human and the cubs. The fight became a blur of movement, claws tearing teeth, snapping the ground, churning under their feet. Scar and the beast locked together in a deadly embrace, each trying to drive the other into the ground. The human circled the fight, looking for the opening that could turn the tide. The moment came when Scar's bite forced the beast to rear back, exposing its throat. For just an instant, the human moved in, driving the shard deep into that vulnerable place and twisting hard. The beast roared once more, the sound filled with fury and pain. Then it stumbled, its legs folding under it. Scar did not let go until the body stopped moving, the deep chest no longer rising. He stepped back, his fur wet with blood, his eyes fixed on the still form. The human stood breathing hard, the shard slick in its grip. The cubs pressed close to its chest, their small hearts racing under its hand. Silence fell over the crash site, broken only by the slow sound of breath from the two who had survived. The jungle began to stir again, the birds calling from the canopy, the small creatures creeping back into the open. Scar looked at the human and saw not prey, not stranger, but one who had stood against death and not turned away. The human met his gaze, and in that unspoken moment something shifted between them. They moved back into the shelter together, the cubs sat down in their corner, the human sinking to the ground, its wounds bleeding freely now. Scar lay beside it, his body forming a wall between it and the open night that still lingered in the shadow of the trees. The light of the rising sun crept across the ground, touching them both. The scent of blood and battle still hung heavy, but under it was another sent the shared bond of those who had fought as one and survived. Scar knew that the laws of his kind would never have allowed this, yet the laws of the jungle had their own rules, and one of them was simple. If another bleeds for your young, they are no longer outsider. They are part of the hunt and part of the pack. And as the day grew brighter over the broken metal bones of the old crash site, Scar accepted that this human was now bound to him and his bloodline for as long as the moons rose over the jungle. The sun climbed higher over the jungle, casting long beams of gold through the broken canopy. The heat began to rise, carrying the thick scent of wet earth and the memory of blood. The crash site lay quiet now, the ground still marked by the deep lines of claws and the dark stains left by the fallen. Scar stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes sweeping the tree line for any sign of movement. The jungle seemed to breathe easier, but he knew its peace was never more than a fragile skin over the constant hunger that lived in its shadows. Behind him the human moved slowly, within the shelter, its body stiff from wounds taken in the fight. It tended to the cubs with hands that shook slightly, but still held steady enough to feed them from a pouch of dried meat. The cubs pressed close to it, their small tails curling around its arm, their eyes bright now that the danger had passed. Scar watched them for a long moment and felt a strange pull in his chest again, the same pull he had felt when he had first seen them sleeping against the human's chest. By the laws of his kind, the human should have been driven out of the range once the cubs were returned. No predator trusted an outsider with their young, yet the memory of the siege and the last stand burned too deep to ignore. The human had bled for the cubs, had faced the teeth of the rival pack and the deep forest beast without turning away. Such acts were not forgotten in the wild. They were carved into the story of the bloodline itself. Debts like that were not measured in days, they were measured in lifetimes. The human noticed his gaze and met it without flinching, its eyes dark and steady even in exhaustion. It gave a small nod, the kind that warriors shared after a battle when no words were needed. Scar gave a low rumble in answer, not a threat, but an acknowledgement. The sound seemed to ease something in the air between them. Outside, the calls of the day creatures began to rise, the jungle shaking off the night silence. Scar left the shelter and began to walk the perimeter of the crash site, his nose testing the wind for any trace of the rival pack. He found faint trails in the dirt where they had fled, their paws carrying them deep into the forest. They would not return soon, not with the memory of their leader's death fresh in their minds. But he knew they would not forget, and neither would their young. The wild had its own memory, and grudges lasted across seasons. When he returned to the shelter, the human was binding its side with strips of cloth torn from its own clothing. The wounds were deep but clean. The human worked in silence, but its movements showed it had done this before. Scar sat just inside the entrance, his presence filling the space like a living wall. The cubs had curled into a small heap between them, their bodies warm and safe, their breathing soft. The human glanced at him once, then back to its work, as if his watching was simply part of the air now. As the day stretched on, Scar brought the human pieces of fresh kill from the jungle, small enough for it to prepare with the strange tools it carried. At first the human hesitated, then accepted, cutting the meat into strips and heating it over a small flame. The scent of cooking filled the shelter, and even Scar found his mouth watering, though his kind did not eat meat that way. The cubs ate first, tearing at the pieces with small sharp teeth, their tails flicking in contentment. The human smiled faintly at the sight, and Scar felt the pull in his chest tighten again. The next days passed in a rhythm that was both strange and natural. Scar hunted and patrolled the range, keeping the shelter within his reach. The human repaired parts of the wreck to make it stronger against the wind and rain. At night they rested in the same space, the cubs often sleeping with their small bodies pressed between them. No words were spoken about what would come next, yet the bond deepened in the quiet acts of survival and shared watchfulness. One morning Scar returned from the far ridge, with news carried in the scent of the wind. The sky was not clear, it was cut by the deep burn of engines and the sharp metallic taste of ships entering the air above the jungle. He had smelled this before on the night of the first crash. The human stepped outside the shelter, its eyes scanning the horizon where faint trails of smoke and light cut through the clouds. It stood very still for a long time, its face unreadable. The ships were coming closer, their sound a low hum that grew in the air. Scar felt the old instinct rise in him to defend his range from any who crossed into it. The human looked at him, then at the cubs, and he could see the choice being weighed in its eyes. These were its kind, yet they were strangers to this place, strangers to the wild, and to the law of blood that bound it now to the Alpha's family. The human took a slow breath, and shook its head, as if coming to a decision. It moved quickly, gathering its pack and a few pieces of gear, then knelt beside the cubs, speaking to them in a voice low and warm. Scar could not understand the words, but he knew their meaning in the way the cubs pressed close and chirped softly in answer. The human looked up at him and gave a nod, one that carried the weight of both thanks and farewell. But Scar stepped forward, blocking its path, his head lowering until his eyes were level with the human's. In his kind, there was only one way to show what came next. He touched his nose to the human's chest, where the cubs had once slept, and gave a deep rumble that carried through the ground itself. The human froze, understanding dawning slowly. Scar stepped back and let the human see the truth in his gaze. It was not leaving. Not now. Not while the ships above might carry danger to the cubs. The human's shoulders eased, and it set the pack down again. Together they moved to the edge of the clearing, watching as the shapes of the ships passed far overhead without landing. The danger faded into the distance, leaving the jungle to its own rhythms once more. In the seasons that followed, the story of the human who had fought beside the Alpha spread through the range. No predator challenged its presence, no rival touched the cubs. The human learned the ways of the jungle, walking paths no skyborn had walked before. It learned the scent of the coming rains, the warning calls of the high canopy birds, the places where the deep forest predators slept. Scar watched and knew that the debt was no longer one to be repaid, but one that had bound them as kin. Years later, when the cubs were grown and strong, their fur marked with the signs of the Alpha line, they still returned to the shelter where the human lived. They brought kills to its door as they would to any member of the pack they trusted, and in the evenings they would curl beside it, listening to the quiet sounds it made as it shaped strange tools from the old wreck. Scar would lie nearby, his golden eyes half closed, yet always watching the treeline for whatever the jungle might send next. And so the predator's debt became more than a memory. It became a part of the bloodline's law story, passed from one season to the next. The Alpha who fought beside a human, and the human who guarded the Alpha's cubs. And whenever the wind carried the scent of ships from the sky, Scar would stand at the clearing's edge, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to defend not only his own kind, but the strange ally who had once been a stranger and had become something far greater.